Thank you very much. What I would like to add is that I published quite a few books after 2007. In 2011, I published the first study of commercial relations between Dubrovnik and the Ottoman Empire. That came out in English in Istanbul in 2011. Then I published a book on Byzantium, which came out on the Komnenian period. In 2019, I published a book called Brother, which talks about the conversion in the Ottoman Balkans from Christianity to Islam, including some very well-known examples like Mehmed Pasha Sokolovic and Ömer Pasha Latas. And then just a couple of months ago, the Croatian Institute of History published my work on the Patriciate of Dubrovnik, Vlastela Dubrovačka, in 2 volumes. This is the first of its kind, not just in Croatian studies, but I think probably in the world. And this is a quantitative study of the interrelationship between genealogical foundations of the Patriciate and their involvement in politics, as well as their investments in the capital, so that you have a complete interaction. Now, I'd like to start by, first of all, thanking the Czech Academy of Sciences and its many institutes for providing us with this unheard of luxury in here, and also I would like to single out the Secretary General of our commission. This is the Slavic Commission, Frank Hadler, who also was involved in the preparation of this. And I would like to start by saying that this is a great honor for me to be giving the opening paper. But in a certain way, it may be appropriate in a sense that the initiative for the convening of the Prague Slav Congress came from a Croat. And this was Ivan Kukuljević Sakcinski. And I will come to that later. But also another Croat, Milan Prelog, published, which in my opinion is still the best overall treatment of the so-called Slavic Renaissance. It's called Slavenska Renesansa in Croatian, from 1780 to 1848. And this came out almost 100 years ago in 1924. Now, being a Croat, of course, I feel that, this is a great honor that both the Czech Academy and the Slavic Commission has done me. Since I will be talking about 5 Slavic scholars and pioneers, I would like just to mention that those of you who would like to get a sort of a very handy bibliographical introduction to what's been written on these people, can do no better than buy or get the Lexicon České literatury, which is in 6 or 7 volumes, and which, of course, includes entries with extensive bibliographies in all languages on Dobrovsky, on Kolar, on Šafaršik, and on Štur. On Guy, who is my 5th person that I'm talking about, the best overall biography, intellectual biography, is by someone I met 50 years ago in the States when I was a student, Elinor Marie Despalatovic. I think she's still alive. And the Croatian edition has just been published a few years ago. Yeah, this is it. This is it. Okay. Now, the title of my paper is To Be One Once More, and it deals with the concept of Slavic unity from Dobrovsky to the Prague Slav Congress, of course, of 1848. There is a statement in the opening section of the oldest Slavic chronicle, the so-called primary chronicle, or Pierwonachalnaya Lietopis, which summarizes this concept of Slavic unity in the 11th century.
Can I help you with PowerPoint?
No, we should go back to Dobrovsky. Yeah, Dobrovsky, that's fine. Yeah, no, this is fine. Thank you very much. And it says, Bjebo edin jazyk slovenesk. Now, this was translated by Šerbovic-Vecer, and he translated the entire chronicle into English, as there was a single Slavic race. Now, this is a rather unfortunate, loaded, and misleading term. It means, actually, there was a single Slavic language, jazyk, or however you have it in different Slavic languages. Always the primary meaning of it is language. From it, all other meanings are derived. Now, this statement was repeated either verbatim or in a slightly paraphrased form in every one of the chronicles among the Eastern Slavs from the 12th to the 16th century. And I analyzed them all. It is either included as it was, or it was slightly paraphrased. And always in the introduction, where the reader would see it first. Of course, this idea of Slavic unity was also present in many other medieval sources, and in the works of Pribojevich, Orbini, Gundulic, Križanić, and others between the 16th and 18th centuries. And of course, in some of my books, I dealt with that at great length. At the end of the 18th century, this concept of Slavic unity was reshaped by Dobrovsky to be laid as the foundation of the Slavic studies. Now, I have devoted more to Dobrovsky than to the other four ones, because I consider him, and I think I'm in a good company, as the founder of Slavic studies. There is an almost universal agreement among Slavic scholars that the beginning of Slavic studies as a branch of scholarship must be dated from Dobrovsky's researches and publications in the last third of the 18th century. There is no question that, as Edward Keenan, among many others, put it, Dobrovsky, 1753 to 1829, was arguably the greatest Slavist who ever lived. Yet it should be pointed out that he came to some of his most important conclusions in a rather convoluted way, full of twists and turns, and he was mightily aided in his endeavor by his older colleague, whom Dobrovsky considered his mentor, Fortunat Durich, 1738 to 1802. The correspondence between Dobrovsky, as a younger man, and Durich shows the gestation period of future Slavic studies. This correspondence was published by Adolf Patera, Korespondence Jozefa Dobrovského, Dil Prvi, Vzájemné dopisy Jozefa Dobrovského a Fortunata Duricha, 1778 to 1800, and of course I will be referring to it. Now, this correspondence is the most important source for the emergence of Slavic studies. In one of his first letters to Durich, Dobrovsky dealt with the notion of the common language of the Slavs. He argued that it is not possible to find in ancient authors the stem of peoples referred to under the name Slavs. This is a very disputed question that we might raise in a discussion. I'll leave it for the moment right there. Despite this, the only common denominator for these peoples, though badly put in his opinion, is to call languages these peoples spoke Slavic. In his original Latin, the correspondence is all in Latin, linguas qui utuntur hi populi placuit appellari communi vocabulo iterum male Slavicas. There is no question that Dobrovsky was just beginning to grapple with the fundamental problem of Slavic studies. How to account for the creation of separate Slavic languages from the presumed common language, the Slavic Ursprache. Nevertheless, at the very beginning of this very long and protracted struggle with this problem, Dobrovsky already made clear his belief in this idea of the primordial unity of the Slavs on the basis of a common language. There was the time when the whole Slavic people, Slavica gens universa, spoke one language, uno labio loqueretur, but certainly before the 6th century, sed certe ante sextum seculum. It is Dobrovsky's letter of March the 14th, 1792, that is of primary importance. He starts the debate about whether the name Slav is derived from Slovo or Slava, and argues that Slovu is to be preferred. He then offered his own explanation. From the word Slovensky, he derived Slovan, meaning someone who speaks loquentem. This goes back to Slovo. Using the opposition Slovan versus Němec, that is the mute, he does not side fully with Dubravsky. I mean, Dubravsky is a Czech scholar of the 16th century, arguing that it is also possible that it is equally possible that Slovan is derived either from Slovo or Slava. I think Dubravsky understood that the two terms of origin are not mutually exclusive. By the way, may I just add here at this point that this has been the longest, the most protected, and the bitterest debate in Slavic studies ever. Whether the word for the Slavs, comes from Slovo or Slava. And I will come to it in a minute. But what the consensus of the Slavic scholars today, I mean the linguists and the etymologists, is that they are not mutually exclusive, that they are actually derived from a common root, which comes from sluti or sluhu, and therefore means to listen. And by the way, I was very pleasantly surprised because last night I went to Karlove náměstí and got myself the etymologický slovník jazyka staroslovenského, and surprise, surprise, on 4 pages, it all goes back to Dubrovsky. In 200 years, we are still, dealing with the same problem, but now it's been settled. So we can have more about it in the discussion. It was Durich who finally persuaded Dubrovsky that it was from Slovo and not Slava that the Slavic name for themselves was derived. And it was after his return from Stockholm that Dubrovsky finally sided with Durich on the strength of Dubrovsky's, now this is the 16th century, not Dubrovsky, Dubrovsky's and Pulkava's explications. From the Adriatic Sea to the Great Novgorod and from Alba to the Black Sea, they called themselves Slovanos, Slovianinos, Slovakos. Durich argued, and he quoted Pulkava's famous dictum, a single Slavic language, unum idioma Slovanicum, from which the Slavic peoples are called in their language, namely Slovo. De quo gentes eiusdem idiomati Slovani sunt vocati, in lingua eorum enim Slovo. Durich quoted the rest of Pulkava's statement, namely that the proper term is the Slovanicum, but that its corrupt form is Slavonicum. And he quoted Junie Palmotic, a 17th century poet from my city Dubrovnik, na slovinský jazyk, koji od Adrie mora redom svu koliku zemlju svoj. Durch concluded by referring back to Pulkava's notion that the Slavs derived their name from a single speech, Slavos vel potius Slovanos, nunc upatus eudictos addictione sermone uno, emphasis in the original, sermone uno. In 1792-93, Dubrovsky made a trip to Russia. There is no question that Dubrovsky's stay in Imperial Russia was the single most important event in the making of a great Slavic scholar. While his familiarity with Czech and South Slavic sources gave him an initial head start over all others, and there were no real pretenders, let's face it, it was only after he got acquainted with material in Russia that he could assess the whole breadth of Slavic studies. What his stay in Russia did was to make him a Slavist in the broadest possible sense. In many ways, his Russian visit was the birthplace of Slavic studies. The notes Dubrovsky took in Russia served him well for the rest of his life. He died on January 6, 1829. And they are found in the National Museum in Prague. Indeed, the next 30 years, until his death in 1829, were to see the emergence of Slavic studies confidently led by Josef Dubrovsky. By the time of his death, or shortly thereafter, Slavic studies were established as a discipline in all the major centers of Slavdom, from Prague and Krakow, from Zagreb to Moscow, from Vienna to St. Petersburg. Central to this evolution was Dubrovsky's contribution, his fundamental work on the Old Church Slavonic, Institutiones Linguae Slavicae Dialecti Veteris, published in Vienna in 1822. In the same year, he stated that there were 9 Slavic peoples, We'll come back to that at the end. Russian, Illyrian or Serb, Croat, Slovene, Korotanish, Slovak, Bohemian, Lusatian Sorb, and Polish. Dobrowski stated that, quote, "We Slavs must hold together. Wir Slaven müssen zusammenhalten." This notion of togetherness, of linguistic affinity, based on the primordial linguistic unity of all the Slavs, was at the core of the notion of reciprocity, or Wechselseitigkeit, but was a cornerstone of the idea of Slavic unity, Einheit, Jednota, Jedinstvo. In the 20 years between Dobrowski's death in 1829 and the opening of the Prague Slav Congress in 1848, 4 other prominent Slavic scholars also adopted the concept of Slavic unity. Kolar, Šafaržik, we'll come to back in a minute, Štur, and Guy. In his epic poem, Slavit Cera, of 1824, Kolar had already sang of this unity, while in his works, Raspravách o kmenách, pučatkách I starožitnotechu národu Slovensko a gecho kmeni of 1830 and o literárnej vzájemnosti mezi kmeni o narečení slavskými of 1836, he stated that there was a single Slavic nation with 4 tribes or branches, Russian, Polish, Czech, and Illyrian. He posited the notion of all Slavdom, Všeslavenstvo, and of Všeslavia. The so-called generation of Všeslavia included also Šafaržik, who in his groundbreaking Geschichte der slawischen Sprache und Literatur nach allen Mundarten of 1826 gave the following classification of Slavic dialects, since he believed, like Dobrowski and Kolar, that there was a single Slavic language. Russian group with Russian and Rusine, Serbian group with Bulgarian, Serbian, Montenegrin, Slavonian, and Dalmatian. Maybe we should look at this because I have it in a separate table, and then we'll come back to these people. Oh, here it is. Can you see it?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So now I'll repeat it. Russian group with Russian and Rusine. By Rusine, of course, they mean Ukrainian of the Western variety in the Habsburg monarchy, but that would cover also Ukrainians. Serbian group with Bulgarian, Serbian, Montenegrin, Slavonian, and Dalmatian. Croatian group, Slovenian group, Bohemian group with Czech and Moravians. Slovak group, Sobr-Vendish group, and Polish group. He considered Great Moravia, Velikomoravska, as the original common state of the Slavs in the past. It was Ljudevit Guy. It was Ljudevit Guy, the leader of the so-called Illyrian national movement, which was a term used by Guy to refer to all the South Slavic peoples, but which was truly a Croatian national revival, who saw that both Šafaržik and Kolar had a very incorrect and imprecise notions about the South Slavs. In particular, they separated the Croats in Croatia Slavonia, that is the Hungarian area of the monarchy, from those on the littoral, that is in Istria, Dalmatia, and Dubrovnik, as well as in the military frontier, Militärgrenzen, and Bosnia and Herzegovina. In 1830, in an unpublished manuscript under the title Über die Vereinigung der in den alt-illyrischen Distrikten wohnenden Slawen zu einer Büchersprache, on the unification of the Slavs living in the old Illyrian regions into a single literary language, by the way, written in German, Guy started on the classification of South Slavic so-called dialects, but did not finish it. Guy referred to the Illyrian as the South Slavic dialect and was opposed to both Kolar and Šafaržik in considering Croatian as a branch or sub-branch of Serb or Slovene. Ljudevit Guy considered his Illyrian language as Croato-Slavic, not as it is often erroneously reported even in textbooks in former Yugoslavia and in some textbooks in Croatia today as Croato-Slavonian. No, Croato-Slavic. It was Ljudevit Guy who finally worked out the classification of South Slavic languages in his article Naš narod, that is Our People, published in 1835. By the way, by nasz naród, he means all the Slavs as a whole. This article was squarely based on Schafarczyk's Geschichte der slawischen Sprache und Literatur, but most importantly, with Guy's correction of Schafarczyk's listing of South Slavic dialects. Guy agreed with Schafarczyk as far as the Russian and Polish dialects are concerned, but put Czechs, Moravians, Slovaks, and Sorbs into the Czech dialect, and this was decisive. Under the Illyrian dialect, he put Slovenes, Croats, Slavonians, Dalmatians, Bosnians, Montenegrins, Serbs, and Bulgarians. It's quite clear by Illyrian he meant, of course, South Slavic, because he held an erroneous notion that the South Slavs in the past, in antiquity, were known as Illyrians, which is, of course, completely untrue. In the same article of 1835, published in his newspaper Danica, that is the Morning Star, Guy considered nasz naród, that is our people, the single Slavic language, and in German he referred to it as Sprache, or Slavische Sprache. Following Kolar, but not Schafarczyk, Guy divided the Slavic languages into 4 dialects: Russian, Czech, Polish, and Illyrian, that is South Slavics. But whereas Schafarczyk considered as Serbian dialect Bulgarian, Serbian, Bosnian, Montenegrin, Slavonian, and Dalmatian, thereby leaving Croatian and Slovene as subdialects of Serbian, Guy established the classification of South Slavic languages as Illyrian rather than Serbian. On the basis of such a classification of Slavic, and above all South Slavic languages, Guy's right-hand man, Ivan Kukuljević-Saksinski, published in Guy's own paper an article, What Should Our General Policy Be?, on April 20th, 1848. In it he called for a general assembly of all the Slavs, jedan općeniti sabor svih grana naroda, grana in the plural. This was carried over in Narodne noviny in Prague on April 30th, 1848, the same day that Ljudevich Štur arrived in the city. Kukuljević's idea was taken by Štur, who in his Appeal to the Slavs Brothers, issued in Prague on May 1st, 1848, and his address to the Slavic Congress, called for Slavic unity. Štur summed it up best when he argued that, quote, after long centuries during which we forgot one another, during which so many misfortunes rained down upon us, we have arrived at the consciousness of our unity, that we are brothers, end of quote. All 5 considered all the Slavic languages as developing from one common Slavic language, the Ursprache. It was on the linguistic, I stress, linguistic basis primarily, that the unity of the Slavs was predicated. Bjebon edin jazyk slovenesk. There was a single Slavic language. And thank you very much for your attention. And may I say in Croatian, hvala. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Zdenko, for this presentation, which showed us that the way to Prague by using the language, the most important element, was much longer than the 19th century. It started in the 17th and through the 18th century, and you have been naming all these names which have been thinking about the unity of the Slavs before. So since there is a rather difference between this presentation and the next one about the Jews, I would suggest that we can have a short discussion now for 5 or 6 minutes or so. Do you have any questions? Please.
Would you consider the possibility that other scholars before Dobrovsky were maybe even founders of Slavic studies?
Well,
like Schweitzer, for instance?
the problem with, people like Schletzer, who were great scholars, and particularly as far as the Nestor Chronique is considered and so forth, is that they were still groping with some of the fundamental problems that Dąbrowski himself had to grapple with. And this is on the basis of what do you call the Slavs and so forth. This is where the problem was. And I think Dąbrowski was the first who, after so many attempts by Schletzer and others, and by the way, I mean, this goes back, to the 14th and 15th centuries, where, you have Pulkava and Dąbrowski, and by the way, Marcin Kromer, whom I didn't mention. But Marcin Kromer was the first one who decisively established, for his times, that the opposition Slav German, namely Slovan and Nemec, is based on the Germans not being able to understand the Slavs, which is still, the acceptable and the prevalent explanation. So I would definitely, yes, I would do that. But I would argue that, let me rephrase this. I think Slavic studies would not have been possible had it not been for two pioneers who were not Slavs. One of them was Sir William Jones, who was the first one in 1786 in Calcutta, who established that Old Greek, ancient Greek, Latin, and Sanskrit are related. He was the first, 1786. This was published in the Proceedings of the Journal of the Asiatic Society in Calcutta and so forth. And by the way, my former colleague, he's retired now, Shuman Mukherjee wrote a book on it, did a PhD on it at Oxford. The other one is, of course, the great German scholar Bopp, who did the classification of the languages and who established, that Slavic languages are closely related not just to the Baltic and particularly the Lithuanian and the Latvian, not the Estonian and Finnish, because that's a different group, but also to the North Indian languages. And this can be, so Bopp would have been in the background of what, Dąbrowski and the others were doing. But yes, I would definitely agree with you. Yes, go ahead.
Okay.
You moderate, yes.
A little question. Do the classification of Slavic languages form or build different nationalities?
Look, let me rephrase that and say this way. As you know, I think most of us here are over 40, not to say 30. And you would have known that when we were studying these things, let's say 40 or 50 years ago, or even 30 years ago, there were no such languages as Montenegrine and Bosnian and so forth. So I would argue, particularly as far as the South Slavic languages are concerned, that during the 19th and 20th century, nationality was formed on the basis of language primarily, but also of regional differences in language. So may I throw a cat among the pigeons and say and argue that the linguistic differences between the Croats and the Serbs are less than between the Czechs and the Slovaks. Would everybody agree with that?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, all right. So in other words, and by the way, some of these people included the Slovaks as Czechs or in the Czech group and so forth. So, somebody said that a language has bayonets behind it. So in other words, you can create, a language as opposed to a dialect. I will not go any further into that, but maybe we can discuss it if others have. Let's have more questions about this. Is there anybody else that? Yeah, go ahead.
Maybe 2 points. First, to my mind, it's an obvious fact that to a large extent, Dobrovsky was inspired by Herder's view of.
Yes. Yes, but that is about the peaceful nature of the Slav. Yes, of course. Yeah, no question about it. Yes.
And then I would like to focus on the variant of your outstanding presentation, by the way.
Thank you.
Namely, just in the variant of your presentation, you named some South Slavonic scholars or politicians who called for a universal Slav meeting. Date is the end, mostly the end of April. It seems that maybe this calling for such a meeting might be explained as a natural reaction to a similar German meeting.
Absolutely. Yes. Yes.
And the date of very famous Polacky's letter to
Yeah,
Frankfurt.
exactly. Yes. Yes, yes. I just mentioned the one who actually called for this meeting, which is Ivan Kukuljevich Sakcinski, because now what I haven't talked about, because it deals with the Croatian language as opposed to Serbian language, is that Guy not only was very much Kolar's disciple, Guy was very acquainted with Shafarzik as well, because he studied in Pest and he studied in Bratislava, Požun, as it was known at the time, and so forth. But also, and I think most people familiar with Slavic languages would know, Guy borrowed Czech orthography for Croatian. So, you know, you know, it's all of those diacritics, I would say, they are all actually Czech. And he made no bones about this, you know, that he took it over. And he saw this because, you know, he believed, as I said, in the unity of the Slavs, and therefore he saw no reason why one Slavic people, you know, or dialect should not borrow from the other, and so forth. I will not go into his political plans, because and Elion Marit Despalatovic pointed this out. He was very much a Pan-Slav. I mean, he wrote a letter to Nicholas I offering his services, which wasn't exactly, you know, the nice thing to do, you know, considering what Imperial Russia was at the time. But he certainly believed that, and this is the reason why Guy chose the Shtokavian dialect. As you know, there's Kajkavian, Chakavian, Shtokavian dialect of the Croatian. Why? Because it was shared with the Serbs. And therefore, he, in many ways, you know, was willing to contemplate a common literary language with the Serbs and the others. And this is the foundation of the later Serbo-Croatian, Croatian-Serbian, and so forth, the Đura Danicic and all the others in the 19th century. This is beyond 1848, so I don't discuss it. But yes, this is because they all believed in this. As I'm sure, I don't know quite as much as some of you here know about, you know, how many Slovaks felt about the Czechs and the Czechs about the Slovaks, and whether it's one people or two peoples, or, you know, two languages and whatnot and so forth. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think under Masaryk, I mean Tomáš Garik, wasn't it this an official doctrine that there was a single Czechoslovak nation, right? And this was of course when the communists came, they then changed it. But was that the case? Am I right about this?
Yeah, but not the language.
Not the language, okay, but I mean the how should I put it? The fiction was maintained that this was a single thing, wasn't it?
So one last question.
Okay.
And then we have to
Just one short point to know, which was the link between language, nation, and politics, right? When I was learning what was called Serbo-Croatian, we had a lecturer in Sofia, a young lady from Dubrovnik. She never used Srpsko-Hrvatski jazyk. Hrvatsko-Srpski jazyk.
That's right.
Now I know 4 languages.
Yeah.
Serbian, Croat, Montenegrin, Bosnian, maybe I will learn also Mongolian
Yeah.
in future. Definitely, philologically, it's the same language, but politically,
Exactly.
they are really 4. So it depends how I call that language.
Yes.
Not what it really is, you know.
That's right. Yeah.
Bulgarians do not recognize Macedonian language, saying it's a dialect of Bulgarian.
Yes, absolutely.
Philologically, they may be right, despite that the differences are bigger
But,
than between Czech and Slovak.
But
When we call it Macedonian,
yeah.
it means that we want to separate from
Yeah.
the Bulgarians.
By the way, I don't know, sorry, did I cut you off? I didn't mean to. But did anybody see this? I saw that on television. When the Russian troops, you know, the present Russian troops, occupied Kherson before they were, you know, before they retreated, there were huge billboards, I mean, not one, but dozens of them, saying, you know, Edin narod, jedan narod. In other words, and by the way, let me just be personal in here. In 2007, I was doing research in Russia, and I was a guest of the Academy of Sciences in Moscow and so forth. And one of my students, not in Russia, of course, but, you know, in Sydney, wanted to do, she was Ukrainian, wanted to do Ukrainian nationalism, how it started and all this sort of stuff. And there was a book that the Russian Academy of Sciences published. It was a collective work. And I went down to the Kantor, you know, where they have a bookshop in the basement of the Russian Academy of Sciences. And I asked in Russian for that and so forth. And there was this, one of the academicians, as they call them and so forth, and she just stood up and said, "Нет украинской национальности." And this was in 2007, and I knew this was a big problem, you know. And of course, being familiar with what happened in the Balkans and was happening, you know, it should have rung the bells, you know, of alarm. But in 2007, nobody was to, you know, predict what would happen. But that's what it says, Един народ, you know. And I'm sure that some of you also know about this sort of thing.